Hello. So, welcome everybody. My name is Merritt Wilson, and I'm the host tonight for this live online weekly Dharma gathering with Shambhala Online. Tonight's talk is called The Two Truths: Identity, Politics, Nonduality and Radicalism. And KT Tierney is giving this talk, and we'll start with guided meditation and then hear from KT, and then end with Q&A. You'll need to know that for the Q&A portion, we'll use the raise your hand feature on Zoom, and you'll find that on Zoom, and then I'll highlight you and your video will come up and you can ask your question. We're recording, so if you don't want to be seen, you can turn off your camera and ask your question. The recording of tonight's talk can be accessed tomorrow in your Shambhala Online account. So I'm going to introduce KT. KLM Tenderness Tierney, aka KT, currently lives in a vintage Airstream trailer with one person and two dogs in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They are interested in the intersection of meditation, art, and social justice. KT is active in the Pittsburgh Center, where they lead a monthly meditation group for trans, queer, and non-binary people. They are also a social justice facilitator and a white anti-racist trainer. They enjoy swimming in the ocean, being in the forest, and gazing at the sky. And you can probably tell that we're currently sitting in the same room. So I think I'll let KT take it from here. And I just want to make sure that everyone can hear us. You can say something in the chat if you can't.
Maybe do more. Or just can people hear me? Maybe people can just chat. Okay. Seems like hopefully people can hear me, and you can just type in the chat if you can't, and Merritt will let me know. As she said, we are in the same place. We're going to begin with a little bit of a meditation. So you can just get yourself comfortable in whatever meditation posture you would like. And say a couple things. It is the evening, so it's for many of us the end of the day. Maybe actually we could just take a moment to honor the day that we've had. And just bring a little bit of awareness to what we're carrying with us in our bodies or our minds, what we're bringing to this virtual space with us. It might be agitation or tiredness or frustration or joy, whatever that is. Just bring some awareness to it and, an appreciation and an acknowledgement of that. Next, I'm just gonna invite everyone to, you could close your eyes if you like, or you could leave them open. Bring a little bit of awareness to your body. And you could even sort of wiggle your toes or sort of clench your knees with your hands or shrug your shoulders. Just anything to sort of bring an awareness to the edges of your body and where the edges of your body meet the ground and the earth, or where they interact with space. Often in the Zoom space or these virtual spaces, we kind of just become disembodied heads. So it's nice to start out just honoring and acknowledging that we all have bodies and that we need to attend to them and that they're a part of the practice. Just appreciating our bodies and all their intricacies and simplicities, all the things that each of our bodies are doing, which we're not even taking note of. Breathing and pushing blood around and being host to bacteria and other things. Next, if you had your eyes closed or not, you could just bring some awareness to what's in your visual field, just kind of broadly, without focusing on anything. Just noticing light bouncing off of objects. Finally, we can bring awareness to the whole sensory situation, whether it's the feeling of a breeze on our arm or the sound of birds outside or the sound of a fan. We can bring all of that into our awareness as well. The quality of being fully immersed in wherever we are, not separate from our surroundings. pushing away the things that we like, or grasping for the things that we dislike, or grasping for the things that we do like, but just actually resting in this awareness. Finally, we'll turn our awareness back on ourselves and contemplate our own identity. Is there an essential part of us that is an identity? Do you have some quality or feature that makes you you? Are there multiple qualities and features? Have those pieces of your identity changed throughout your life? Or are they essential and unchanging? Is your identity something that's merely within yourself? Or is it ways that you relate to others and society? Does your identity have a color, a shape, a sound, a texture? Would you still be you without those pieces of you? Is your identity something that's inside of you? Or is it external to you? Where does it reside? Is it something that wholly is of your own making? Or is it something that is made in part by others, whether it's desired or undesired? Does it cause you pain or bring you pleasure, or both? When you die, what happens to that identity? What about your identity made you show up to hear this talk? Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your practice and for being here. I'm going to get started. Again, my name is KT, and I'd like to thank, first of all, Shante and Adriana for inviting me to give a talk, and for everyone who is a part of the weekly Dharma gatherings and making it happen. Thank you all. Also, I would like to thank Tierney Busby and Adam LaBelle for their wisdom and friendship. And I would also like to thank Merritt Wilson for hosting and for listening to me talk about the two truths as I've been studying over the past couple of weeks. So I got interested originally in this topic. It's a big one and it's quite a lot to tackle. And I'll say from the beginning that I'm not really going to give a didactic presentation about the whole of the two truths and how it differs, what the Sutantrikas thought versus Zen thought, or Dzogchen, or Madhyamaka, and the different divisions within that. I might make note in some sections what I was sort of reading and where it's coming from. But I think it's important to say that it's kind of a paradox having this sort of these two notions of reality, or these two truths of a absolute and a relative. And it seems to me that as this is arising in early sort of classical Indian Buddhist thought, and it actually predates Buddhism, this idea, maybe a little bit, or at least non-duality does, is it's actually in the sort of hermeneutics or the doctrine of how to interpret the Buddha's early teachings. And there's a couple of schools and divisions, and actually this doctrine changes over the course of time. And a lot of the sources that I was kind of interested was more the Madhyamaka presentation of that, rather than the Sutantrika or other sort of pre-Mahayana thought. And then there's also, I was reading some things, the Gelugpas have this kind of their own little thing, which I was interested in just because it was their own thing, but less interested in. But that's not this. So if you're coming for that, I'm sorry to disappoint you. It's interesting too, because I felt really clear coming into beginning to study things about what I wanted to talk about, and then as I've been reading things and taking in all these different things, I've become so much less clear, and I think that often happens. So any sort of misunderstanding or misrepresentation of things is my own, and not that of the text that I was reading or my teachers. So what are the two truths? From a Madhyamaka perspective or a Mahayana perspective, and this also carries over into a lot of Vajrayana, this would be the same, and actually I think within Zen too, there's both this sort of relative truth or conventional truth, which is that, oh, we have this everyday kind of existence. And while we say Saturday, and even though Saturday doesn't actually exist, it's like it exists. It's a thing. If I say I'm going to be there on Saturday, everybody knows what that means. But it's not some sort of entity that exists outside of our convention of saying it. And then, so within that is all the kind of, in the conventional or the relative, is all these sort of everyday objects of reality. The glass that I'm drinking water out of, the water, the cushion that I'm sitting on, sort of all of that. And then there's the absolute, which in this case, my understanding of it is that it's just emptiness. It's the view that all things are empty of inherent existence or of an essence. And actually, it's extended all the way to emptiness itself. Emptiness itself is existence. It's empty of inherent existence. And it's kind of a wild position, and it could kind of go towards sort of a nihilism, which I'll say a little bit about. But from the sort of Madhyamaka perspective, this is actually what gives agency. The fact that things are empty of an inherent existence means that they can change and shift over time. Because if they had an essence, like if they had this essential quality, they would be fixed and immovable. And so it's actually really a good thing that things don't have this inherent existence, but that they, or essence, but that they can shift and change. And that feels really true to me. At the same time, it's important to note that it's a non-dual perspective. And so these two things are actually inseparable. They're not two things, which is kind of ridiculous. But I guess this is why it's kind of a paradox. And the reason why it's talked about as the middle way is because it's sort of that they are inseparable, they're existing at the same time, and that to me it seems like the sweet spot is sort of both holding the view of emptiness, but then also not losing completely the fact of the relative. And so the sort of traps of this might be, oh, it's just emptiness, right? So it would be a nihilism. It would be, oh, everything is empty, therefore it doesn't matter what I do, I could kill people, it's just all emptiness, we don't actually exist, I don't exist, you don't exist. And in some sense, yes, that's true. As I was talking in the contemplation, it's like, oh, where is this like identity? Where when I start to look, it's actually quite, there's kind of nothing there, even though I have all these things and all these conventions and these bits of myself holding together. When I actually start to look at it, it's quite wispy, like the edges of a cloud moving through the sky. And at the same time, it's not this sort of essentialist kind of like, oh, everything is really fixed and solid and has an essential quality, which is what from the Madhyamaka view is like the good news. And it's actually quite a radical flip to say that they're this kind of, I guess, Narjuna is sort of noted for his writings using the reductio ad absurdum by sort of flipping and saying, oh, the opposite would be absurd. So if it weren't this way, things would be fixed and they would be immovable and they wouldn't change. Therefore, they must be empty of inherent essence. And to sort of underscore the point that it's really important from this perspective, from the Madhyamaka perspective, and for Narjuna to state that this isn't it's not to be understood as these two things to be totally different from each other, because that would actually reify this idea that there is some sort of duality, but actually that they're non-dual and they're not separate from each other. So where does this all fit in with the idea of identity or identity politics, and what relevance do I think that it has for actually working with how we are in the world as maybe people who are interested in sort of the intersection of Buddhism and social justice, and how can these teachings apply? And I think it feels really important to me to underscore this sort of trap of the absolute, of sort of this maybe tendency within Western Buddhism to sort of say like, oh, it's all emptiness, I don't exist and you don't exist, and so kind of just get over it, basically, like, oh yeah, your oppression or your whatever, just get over it, it's all just emptiness anyway. And that also within that, just to say like, oh, actually, when I was leading that sort of contemplative exercise and thinking about identity and identity politics has kind of become this dirty word, both kind of like from the right and then also from the left. And a lot of people who are more in the dominant or mainstream might have a tendency, it isn't always the case, but I've certainly heard sort of like, oh, I've heard perspectives of like, oh, well, what's breaking up the left, or you know, what the problem is all these people with identity politics, it's very divisive, and like this certain group of people get this, and this group of people get that, and this group of people get that. And so if we were just kind of going to go to the extreme of this sort of like emptiness view, it would be denying that that happens. And then at the same time, if we were going to the extreme of an essentialist view, where it's like, oh, you can't change, it's sort of fixed. You know, we all have identities. Actually, we all have identity politics, and people who are in the dominant class actually just aren't noticing that they're in a more position of more power, where they're not experiencing oppression because of their identity. But if their identity suddenly became the one that was not getting access to things, or that their existence was being denied, they would certainly then be, their identity would be have a politics that was more visible. And so I think it feels important to say we all have identity politics. It's just some of them are more visible and some are less visible. And so within this, I find this teaching actually really helpful in the sense that it can both allow space to say, oh, actually, our beings are empty of inherent existence. Or we could also say these categories, these classifications, such as race or gender or class, and so forth, are actually social constructions. And so they don't actually have some sort of essential quality that makes us what we are. Race, for instance, wasn't something that was talked about as it was until the 1600s. And you can go back and look at the history of that beginning to be categorized and classified legally, particularly in the United States, where I currently am. That has a very clear and concise history, which means certain things for some people and certain things for other people, specifically the legacy of chattel slavery, and then segregation, and currently mass incarceration for people who are Black in this country, and then also the indigenous population, that meant something specifically for them of genocide and displacement and continued erasure. And so within this sort of idea of the middle way, it leaves room to say, this actually isn't an essential thing, it's a socially constructed category. And yet, at the same time, not say, get over it, or quit whining, or it's just all emptiness, or we're all one, or we're all the same. It's actually allowing this space for acknowledging that people are experiencing oppression, and that those categories may not be real, but actually within this sort of conventional or relative realm, people are really experiencing, they're having different experiences of reality. And actually, it feels incumbent upon each of us sort of to pay attention to that, and then to also notice our role in that inseparability, whether we're the ones who are experiencing more oppression or more disadvantage because of our certain positionality or our identity politics. And within this sort of non-dual situation, how it might be that because it's not actually, the idea of non-duality is sort of, it's from the Sanskrit term, it's not this unity or one, but it means not two or not separate. And so how can we not sort of create these dualities of self and other, where we're less interested in what's going on with other people than we are with ourselves, or we're less interested in what's going on sort of in the world outside of us, as though it's not that we live in the world and that we're completely a part of this atmosphere. We're inseparable from it. And there's something about this modern capitalist system that we live in that we actually pretend as though we are separate from our environment and from other people, which is creating a lot of chaos and incredible amounts of suffering. And so for me, the question is sort of like, how can we how can we do practices to build our compassion and sort of be with this non-duality. It's not maybe this oneness of this spiritual bypass of sort of like, oh, we're all one, we're all the same, it's totally fine, it's emptiness, whatever. But actually really seeing how we're not separate from the situation. And so that could be really fiercely looking at how we might be contributing to the suffering of others. Yeah, and I guess maybe for a little bit of give a little bit of a personal context of my experience within that. Maybe both as a person of European descent who has done a lot of work around examining my whiteness, and then also as a person in a certain body, and have a certain gendered experience. Yeah, I guess first of all, just sort of coming to the awareness of being white, which doesn't actually happen for white people until they're quite a bit older than people of color, and coming to a deeper and deeper awareness of how incredibly socially ingrained and constructed my view of the world is. And it's actually quite painful how, as I've come to a path of deepening my meditation practice, I've noticed so much more thoughts inside of my head that really don't feel like my own. They certainly don't align with how I think of the world, that are quite ugly and deeply racist. And I begin to sort of work at rooting those out, but I don't. It sort of just feels like they're placed there, and they're like socially put, and there's not like some sort of biological difference of the races. This is actually all put in place as a system of dominance and control, and how deeply socially ingrained that is. And so going back and sort of looking at all the little things that happened as I was growing up, and all the media that I was imbibing, and the way that my parents talked and my family talked, and actually the way that the world is structured, and the way that Black, brown, and indigenous people are criminalized and othered and made to look like they're the problem rather than victims of a system. And then conversely, from where I sit as a non-binary trans person, I have an experience of a gender that is neither male or female, and it's been actually quite painful, and also very incredibly joyful, coming to a sense of fully being myself, and actually learning to have a healing relationship with all the ways in which my internal sense of identity was actually at conflict with what is in the world. And so I do use gender neutral pronouns, and that's a thing that, gender, it's not something that's innate or exists. And you might be like, oh, well, it's sex, but why not just call it sex? Which that even actually there's more than just male and female within that. There's quite a spectrum. Gender is a totally socially constructed thing, and it's not that I can't just like kind of make up my own gender. It's still kind of within a realm or a world, but it's non-dual. It's not this kind of binary. And actually within that, it's become quite liberating to think about sort of, I do think that sort of gender neutral pronouns does this, rather than sort of reifying this idea that, oh, I'm this separate gender or this other thing. I can be in a space and people can be reading me both as male and female in the same space, which I think does so much more to actually destabilize this idea that they're categories that are immutable. And yet, when I ask people to use gender neutral pronouns, Even though it's a convention that's been around since the 1500s, it feels like I'm going all the way down to the bottom of people's belief systems and pulling out one of their core beliefs. And so within the sense of gender and this sort of idea of the middle way is both acknowledging that there is no essential nature of gender, that it doesn't actually exist, it's empty, but at the same time there are these categories and I experience the world in a certain kind of way, and so for me it feels like the sweet spot of that is holding both of those at the same time and not seeing the conventional or the absolute as separate things but existing in the same place at the same time. Is there anything I'm forgetting? If you can't see, I'm asking Merritt, who's sitting right next to me, if there's anything I'm forgetting. Yeah, and I guess, yeah, there are a lot of different perspectives on this, and it's kind of, it's a very, feels like ripe territory, and it just also feels really true that that actually within line of the original teachings of the Buddha, that this sort of path of both not separateness and which goes all the way from the very first teachings of sort of not separating from the world, and then also kind of finding the middle way between extremes feels really important. I think I'll leave it there and see if there's any questions or if people want to have.
Sorry about the feedback. So just to remind you, if you want to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand feature, and I will highlight you, and you'll come up on the screen, and you can talk. Hi, Jay. You can ask your question.
Hi. So that was a nice talk. I want to compliment you on your ambition in trying to figure out the relationship between Madhyamaka and gender identity. So I would offer a couple of thoughts. The term middle way, between the two extremes that you refer to, right? Can you hear me? So the actual definition of that word, middle way, is uma. Uma in Sanskrit is translated as the absence of a middle between the two extremes. So what that means is that it's pointing at the state of mind of the middle way, which in the Zen tradition they say is the mind of not knowing, or the absence of a reference point. So from an experiential point of view, the Madhyamaka is pointing at this experience of, you could say, no mind or no reference point, or the absence of a middle between the two extremes. In other words, just basic gap in your mind. And that is how you experience the emptiness. So emptiness is not, it's not a concept, it's an experience. And so I think that, you know, it seemed to me that it's underlying your understanding of what you were talking about is still kind of solidifying something, solidifying relative truth. You know, you say, well, yes, it's empty, but at the same time, it's relatively true. So let's take it from the relative point of view. Let's, you know, let's go on with our concern about humanity and gender identity and suffering and all of that. But I don't think it's quite as easy as that in these teachings. I don't think that you can quite so quickly, you know, let go of that non-duality between emptiness and relative reality. And the practice here is, as far as I understand it, is the practice of non-reference point altogether, as they say, or the absence of a middle, that moment of gap, non-thought, and that is actually the basic experience that the emptiness teachings are pointing to. So it's that is the reference point. It's the reference point of no reference point, so to speak. And so I would just offer those thoughts to you as a way of looking at that material.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts. And I guess I'm new to this, and as I said at the beginning, I was just gonna offer things from my experience, and any misunderstandings are my own. I guess my question to you is, what is your experience when you go get groceries at the grocery store? Is it emptiness and sort of gap and luminosity, or is it, oh, I have to pay for these, and who is the checkout clerk, and how did I get here?
Yeah, so we all know what samsara is, right?
Do we?
Yeah, samsara is the ongoing dualistic experience that contains endless suffering, right? So when you say, well, what's your experience of going to the grocery store, and do I have to pay for this, or do I have enough money to pay for this, and if I don't have enough money to pay
No,
for
I was asking about your experience specifically of going to the grocery store.
Right, my experience
and
of
who you're interacting with,
right.
how
So,
you're experiencing the world
right,
as an older, what I'm assuming, white cisgendered man.
right, right. My experience of that is the same as my identity. You asked the question, what is your identity?
Mm-hmm.
And when I contemplated that, the only thing I can recognize is as identity in myself is familiarity with my own habitual tendencies. I have the recurring kinds of thoughts and emotions and sensory, perceptual experiences. And they're familiar to me. And the best I can come up with in terms of identity is that familiarity. The familiarity itself has no shape or color, as you were suggesting. It's basic awareness that has the capacity for recognizing the patterns as the same. So that's my ongoing sense of myself. And that is true whether I'm at the grocery store or whatever I'm doing, wherever I am.
Are you only a mind, or are there other things going on? Like, are you having impact on other people? Are other people having experiences of you? What do you think other people's experience of you are? Or are you just merely a mind?
So now you're asking a question at the level of the mind-only school.
Indeed.
And
or brain in a vat, whichever you will. Yeah.
Sorry, say that again.
Do you have ethical causality, or don't you? Or do you have impact on others, or are you just a mind or a brain in a vat?
Mind and my experience, my sensory experience, seems to have impact on others, for sure. But, the question of the reality or the true existence of others is still on the table.
Right. Have you ever asked others what their experience of you is?
Yeah, I mean, I have interacted with lots of people, and what I would, my conclusion about that, which is actually in keeping with the mind-only school's philosophical understanding, which is that everybody has their own experience. And we don't really experience the same things in the same way. We think we do. We sort of gloss over the differences in our experience in order to communicate. Mm-hmm. So if I say, pass the water, you know what I mean, and you pass me a glass of water. But that doesn't mean that your experience in the fine analysis is exactly the same of anything, of that glass of water or anything else. So that's the perspective of the mind-only school. Mm-hmm. In terms of the nature of reality. And that's also what my experience with other people is, kind of in sometimes surprising ways, that people really do experience everything differently from each other. Although we talk as though we were all talking about the same thing.
Yeah, and do you have any sense why people experience things differently?
Because everybody's experience, so that's when you get to the more profound teaching of the mind-only school. So what the mind-only school is saying, and this is talking about the nature of reality, and that is that these appearances of others are not appearing to you because they're really out there, but rather they're appearing to you because they are the product of your own habitual tendencies, the habitual tendencies of your own mind. And so that's why everybody experiences reality differently, because according to Mahayana in general, there is nothing that's real that's out there. There is no other person that's really there, truly existing. Where does that appearance of that other person come from? It comes from your own habitual tendencies of your mind. That's the mind-only school teaching. And that's kind of the starting point for Mahayana philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there are any other, I think I see one hand. Let me see. I'm sorry, I'm just getting used to this kind of Zoom room culture. Yeah, okay. So Amber. Hello. Welcome.
My name is wrong.
I'm sorry. What's your name?
My name is Drew, and Amber Hannah is my old boss. So apparently there's some confusion about my identity.
You said your name's Drew?
Yes.
Hi, Drew.
Hi, KT. Thank you for boldly leaping with this stuff, because it's really yeah, it's heady. But what really connected for me is this question, as you were talking about, why does it hurt to ignore parts of my identity when those parts are essenceless? Like, yeah, that's really what came up for me.
Yeah. So my do you want to say more about that, actually?
I'd be delighted to. Is there anything in particular that you'd like to know?
Well, just any, like, just whatever you feel like sharing. What kind
Well, so I'm sitting at this place, you know, where for like 3+ decades, I have just not recognized that don't fit into the heteronormative gender boxes. And that seems to be the source of a lot of suffering. And just kind of thinking about, it's hard for me to understand like how something that doesn't have an essence could have any, how do feelings happen? Like, how did my feelings happen? You know? Yeah. Does that help? Or is there more that you'd like?
Yeah, well, what came to mind for me was my friend and teacher here. We've been talking about the parts that actually Buddhist philosophy really gets, and then the parts that it kind of misses for a modern Western subject, and maybe they actually didn't need to kind of work on the identity politics side of things. But to me, it seems true that actually to be able to have experiences of emptiness or luminosity or whatever in like the tiny little glimpses I've had in my practice, I actually need to feel safe in the space. I need to feel like I'm seen, and that's not being denied, that I actually have this embodied existence, that I have that I'm in a body. The body's the vehicle actually to awakenment. That's said over and over again. And that this body actually is really threatened by heteronormative reality of our dominant culture, which is what most of Western Buddhism actually is. And that's like 90% of what we're working on the cushion, and that's just not even addressed actually in the Buddhist canon. And so for me, it's like, you know, I've gone to therapy and I've done all these other modalities that support my practice, so that I can actually like heal myself to get to the place where I'm actually able to rest in those experiences, because that's not a given for me always, particularly when I'm like in a retreat or something. I actually often can't even relax because I have this embodied trauma. And I guess I feel really interested in sort of like more where this can feel helpful and not necessarily like getting into the hermeneutics of textual analysis. Like where does it actually feel helpful to you? Like what of this has actually felt helpful to you, Drew, in your experience?
It's existence.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this conversation.
Great.
That it happened. That it was a thing that might happen.
That's so good. Right. Yeah. And it is happening all the time, right? Like, I mean, I think that the thing that I'm really interested in, you know, I studied Western philosophy as an undergraduate, and I studied Judith Butler a lot. and her, she's wonderful if you're actually into sort of heady philosophical things and you've never read Judith Butler. She's great, and she sort of comes out of, she definitely comes out of this postmodern sort of kind of thing after Foucault, but is talking about subjectivity and gender, and actually how we can't sort of create our own gender. There's actually sort of, it's a social construct. It's completely constructed. But we can't actually kind of like escape this sort of like, oh, it's like little costumes that we put on. But it's all that it's performative, that we're performing these sort of genders, and there's actually not that much, although we've seen such a multiplicity of embodiment of gender in the past decade, certainly more so than the 100 years before that, and throughout time there's all sorts of gendered beings. And actually one of the things that I love is the Rigdon and Bodhisattvas. They're changing genders all the time. Narjuna, or not Narjuna, Vimalakirti in that sutra changes gender, changes sex. It's actually, there's no sort of essential quality to it, and that throughout time there's been this notion of it not being essential, and yet we have these experiences in gendered bodies, and so kind of finding our agency within that, of being like, oh right, it's empty, it's essenceless, I have some agency where I can change. It's not determined, I don't have to be this certain kind of way, and that feels really liberating to me.
Yeah, that essencelessness kind of is license to play.
Yeah, exactly.
Like to actually play.
License to play, and it gives you agency. It gives you back. This isn't determined. It's not deterministic, right? And
that's helpful. That's really helpful.
Good. I'm glad I spit that out. That was something that I wanted to say. And it's also not nihilism too. It's like, oh, this does affect people. Actually, people have different experiences in the world because of the bodies that they're in and the way that social pressures act on them. And so it's not, nothing fucking matters too, because it actually does. Yeah. Well, thanks. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
I like your nails.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to meet you.
Good to meet you too.
So if anybody else has a question, you could put your fake hand up. Sadie. Hi, Sadie. You're muted and you don't have your video. There we go.
Hi. I just wanted to say a quick thank you. This has been really wonderful. And I'm reflecting on my experience personally and how I walked into this community 20 some odd years ago, and luckily allowed myself to have a space where I could befriend myself, and how pivotal that was in my life. And then going beyond that, it's about how I can support other people and recognize their suffering and show up for them again and again and again. And so I think that ultimately we shouldn't forget our bodhisattva vow. And it's easy to get lost in philosophy, but when we come back to the experience and our open hearts, and our courage, then we can have these beautiful discussions and present in the world as ourselves. So I don't think I have a question, but I wanted to thank you very much.
Thanks, Sadie. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's one of the things that I was just sort of reflecting on is that's what felt important to me when I got into this. I was like, I was doing all this reading and all this philosophy stuff, which I really love. And then I was like, but what does this have to do with bodhisattva activity? I don't understand. Like, why is this in the Mahayana? And then sort of coming to the other side of it and sort of reading some of the Dzogchen perspectives of being like, actually, there's no difference between the absolute and the relative. Actually, everything is emptiness. And also, for others who don't see that, we're supposed to do the compassionate activity of, whatever it is and being compassionate to those people who aren't seeing that, rather than denying that they're having some other experience.
Yeah.
So thank you, and thank you for coming today.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other hands where we have just a little bit more time?
No, I just like to thank everybody for the questions, comments, and for being here. I feel very humbled by your presence and the questions all today, and I appreciate that. I think that it's, if it were definitive what actually the doctrine of the truths were, we still wouldn't be talking about it. So I feel helpful studying. This is just kind of my first foray into trying to. So thank you everyone for being here. I think that, are they off next time? Yeah, to say, but definitely.
Thank you, KT. So we'll close here. Thanks for joining us. As I said in the beginning, the recorded talk will be posted, and you can access that online. I'm told that this program will be taking a 2-week summer break, and it will restart on July 17th with Dr. I don't know how to pronounce their name, Dr. from Asheville, North Carolina, whose talk is titled Between the Four Noble Rumors and Four Noble Truths. So stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for being here. And